Hi, welcome to More Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Christina Bieber Lake. Christina is a brilliant teacher and author whose works delve deeply into literature, theology, and the human experience. Today we'll explore just a fragment of her life and work, her Christian faith, her acclaimed books, including The Incarnational Art of Flannery O'Connor, Beyond the Story, Prophets of the Posthuman, and The Flourishing Teacher. So, I suppose first of all, then, Christina, can you tell us a little bit about your background? Maybe what are some of the key events or experiences that have led you to your unique Christian faith and calling?
Yeah, well, everybody's story is a little bit different about how they end up in the intersection of intellectual life and faith in particular, right? But for me, I felt from a very early age that there was more to this world than meets the eye, and I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were both Catholic, and it's interesting because my journey away from um, or my journey toward Christianity and a personal relationship with Christ was at first a journey away from Catholicism, like a lot of American Protestantism is. And then through the work of Flannery O'Connor, I found my kind of way back to sacramentology and particularly within the Anglican church. And so I'm an Anglican now, and my husband is an Anglican priest. So
Mhm.
God has a sense of humor. It's like salmon returning to the spawn. But when it comes to uh, intellectually satisfying versions of Christianity, it's really hard to beat Anglicanism or Catholicism in the sense of the sacraments of the world, the world having meaning that shows through creation
Mhm.
is a big part of the way that I think about my academic work and about beauty, the novel, the imagination, all of the things. So to me, this is all interconnected. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it.
Thank you so much. And can you tell us a little bit about maybe one or two figures just who've inspired you over the years, whether that be personal, intellectual, spiritual, or some combination thereof?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different answers to that for different times of your life, right? And you can always, if you're talking to any American Christian who ends up being a professor, C.S. Lewis always comes out of their mouth at some point, right? But for me, because I'm a literary studies person, I teach literature and write about literature. C.S. Lewis is really hard to beat because he was a scholar of literature and also an exemplary writer. Um, and still, to this day, if I feel like I've been reading a lot of things that influence me in a bad way as a writer, as a way of expressing my thoughts, I'll go and read a C.S. Lewis book and get that kind of rhythm and way of thinking
Mhm.
back in my mind and in my language because he got something about the fundamentally metaphoric, illustrative, um, foundational qualities of our language, like connected to the world. And so you never find him going off in abstractions somewhere. He's always pulling it back. Not that you lose intellectual depth with that, right? So C.S. Lewis is an intellectual model for me. And so in my faith journey and my intellectual journey, he's right there. Flannery O'Connor, as we'll talk about, was a really important figure in me in developing that way. And then more recently, people like Rowan Williams and Robert Barron, who's written a lot of books about literature from a Catholic perspective, really interesting. And then theologian that I read a lot is Hans Urs von Balthasar. So
Mhm. No, that's terrific.
that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Those are the things that came into my mind when you
No,
asked. So
absolutely. Thank you so much, Christina. And I suppose today I'd love to just explore some of your written work, which is one of the ways I've got to know you. And then there's some talks online which folks can enjoy. But I think there's some key themes in there, true to the spirit of Lewis and everything I love about Lewis also. So I want to look first, if we may, at Prophets of the Posthuman, covering
yes.
American fiction, biotechnology, and the ethics of personhood. So in that book, then you delve into the intersection of American fiction and biotechnology, particularly raising, I think, vital moral questions about what it means to be human, and not unlike C.S. Lewis with his abolition of man.
Abolition of man. Yeah. Mhm.
So, what inspired that book, and how do its themes resonate in today's world of rapid technological advancement, I suppose, with AI and transhumanism coming to the fore?
Yeah, I'm glad to talk about prophets because that book represented for me a really bizarre moment in my career trajectory. I'd started as a Flannery O'Connor scholar, and I really loved, becoming an expert in Flannery O'Connor. And then I realized that my main interests are in how art intersects with the intellectual life and the decisions that we make and the way that we see the world, particularly the question of what it means to be human. And I've always had what I would call an avocational interest in bioethics, particularly what they call bioethics 3, which is uh, enhancement technologies, things that you're trying to do to make yourself, quote unquote, better, live forever, whatever else like the transhumanists would talk about. And I've always had an interest in that. And we had this thing at Wheaton College for faculty members that was the Center for Applied Christian Ethics would have a seminar for faculty members, and they invite somebody famous or well known or whatever to lead it. And man named I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on him. He's been such a good friend to me when he was at Union University for a really long time. His name will come back to me as soon as I'm not trying to think about it. He was extremely influential because he was the one who came out and gave that seminar. I took it just out of an avocational interest. And then I remember talking to him afterwards and being like, I would really like to write about these issues through fiction because I think these writers have something to say about this issue of what it means to be human and the dangers of posthumanism, the dangers of not thinking that your body is very important, all of these things. And he's like, yeah, let's do it. So that's I credit him with the development of these arguments. And also, I've had a long-standing interest in the issue of what I would call Gnosticism or Manichaeism in American intellectual life, which is easily translated in what you would call techno-Gnosticism. This idea that what you do with your body doesn't matter at all. You are information patterns. That's who you are. It's how you think. Uh, and it's separated. It's a Cartesian dualism that's behind it. It's separated from the body, that the body is then, in a Platonic way, kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? In the way. It's in the way.
Hmm.
It needs to be escaped from and left behind, if you will. And that is not what the incarnation teaches us about the body. And so it's not surprising that if you have a kind of essentially Gnostic view that the body and creation is a fall, that matter is bad, fundamentally being a created being is bad, then you will end up with contempt for actual human beings. And fiction, as you saw from my later books, I believe is inherently theological in that it inherently values all human beings for who they are, limits, and everything, their finitude, all of it, right? So being a Gnostic is at cross purposes with being human in the way that we were created beings made in the image of God, as proven by the incarnation, and the incarnation validates,
Hmm.
right? So we have in the advanced technological societies a kind of inability to understand finitude, the limits of our bodies, the fact that that's a good thing because it helps us to understand our need for grace and how grace is present around us all the time.
Hmm.
So all of these things, it's like you can see them if you study literature. And I mean, we could talk about specific examples if you want, so that you can see what I'm talking about. Is there one that comes into your mind that you want to talk about? I mean, of course, I can.
Yes, that's brilliant. Thank you, Christina. So, one example I was particularly curious about was the work of Nathaniel Hawthorne. I think in part because whenever I was a younger man, I read The True and Only Heaven by Christopher Lash from the States, and I thought it was such an intriguing book where he could take the notion of progress and so on. And it was Hawthorne was a seminal influence on him also. So to then see you reference Hawthorne was so interesting to me. I wonder if you might speak to him and his work and its importance.
Sure. Now, I largely am a scholar of contemporary American literature, basically 1945 to the present. So Hawthorne is an outlier in that regard, but I love all of American literature. And in the 19th century, it was Thoreau and Walden that really got me into wanting to study American literature. So I need to be, give my kudos to the 19th century. Dickinson, huge, Melville, huge, the thinking that goes on there, the deeply rich theological thinking that is in those writers in America is irreplaceable. I mean, they did some very important work. That being said, Emerson is kind of my kicking boy. He's the person I'm always kind of saying, like, he got it wrong, and here's why. But not Thoreau, not Dickinson, and not Hawthorne. And if you study the 19th century American literature, you'll see that there are definitely two different strains there, right? When you're talking about Emerson and the sort of transcendentalists, not Thoreau, because I don't think of him as the same way, and then Melville and Hawthorne and the people who took evil more seriously and understood, looked it in the face. So he looked evil in the face and saw what it is, and saw in the story, the birthmark, which is what I write about, how if you are, and he has a scientist who's married to a woman. For your listeners who don't know the stories, they're a newlywed couple, and you know this right from the start because it's a very short story. And like immediately he says she's got a birthmark on her face, and immediately he says, has it ever occurred to you that that birthmark might be removed and you would be even more beautiful?
Mhm.
And she's like, no, I haven't, because everybody else thinks it makes me unique and beautiful and interesting, and the birthmark comes to mean a lot of things. But the point is that he thinks, as a person, that purity or perfection is what it means to be human. And I want to make her the most beautiful that she possibly could be. And then, of course, in the trying to remove it, he kills her in the process. And this is deeply moral tale, right? Of how perfection is the enemy of the good, to put it one way, but also failure to accept humanity as it is actual ugliness at the end of the day. It's contempt for the things created by God. And it's also a tale about marriage and a failed marriage and what a bad husband would do.
Yeah.
Basically, like she doesn't love her, loves the idea
Mhm.
of her. And that's, Pygmalion, that's in all kinds of ancient texts about love and marriage. So,
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Christina. And another figure who I came across years ago was Walker Percy. I came upon his book, Lost in the Cosmos. I wonder if you might speak about him and maybe what he has to teach us about modern scientism and the reduction of human persons and much of this kind of not just transhuman but post-human language then.
yeah, Percy is such an interesting figure, right? Because I taught him for a number of years because we had a class that was Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy, and these are two Southern writers who are Catholics, who are very different but very similar. And so I got very interested in him, especially during teaching those classes. But I had always read him from before. He was a trained doctor. So, like a lot of people who write what I would call incarnational fiction or have an incarnational imagination, which I mean starting with the body of the world as it is, and showing it has spiritual significance rather than starting with some idea and then giving it flesh. He's a deeply incarnational thinker. So the body of the world has meaning, right? And he saw all around him scientism run amok, which is basically that all of everything that's beautiful and loving and true and whatever can be explained by science or by material facts. Uh, Scientism, natural, there's a lot of different names for it, scientific naturalism, all of these things, but it's like that explains it all away. And he's like, along with Kierkegaard, who's his kind of philosopher hero, is like, no, the universe is fundamentally personal. It consists of people who love each other in a relationship with each other. And he's always big about these dyads and triads and how, like, storyteller is telling somebody else about something and they're in a dyadic relationship that you can't explain. There's no reason for it, just for a bunch of molecules, biological accident that was just, plopped here. And so he's got that just right underneath his pen and he's always scratching against it. And I love that about him.
That's brilliant. And that just brings to my mind something I might speak more about later. But your work in some ways on fiction reminds me of there's a cognitive scientist, John Vervaeke now, who's quite popular online. And he's written about the dialogos. And we talk about dyads and triads, and that at the core of reality talks about relevance realization, about their we're overburdened. There's a oversaturation of facts in the world. So by our very nature as cognitive kind of beings, we have to focus on certain things, and there
Mhm.
it does give us a certain clue to the universe. And your work has helped me so much in that respect with fiction also. So I'm grateful
Thank you.
for both, and I think it's really interesting that those two are intersecting in really interesting ways. And actually, I want to move now to Marilyn Robinson, who's another person that you cover in the book, and she's also written a really fascinating book recently on Genesis, which is galvanizing so many different intellectuals' imaginations today. How might her work then, Gilead in particular, serve as a balm for the burn of much of transhumanism, so to say?
Yes, you're referring to, of course, the last chapter in my, I believe it's the last chapter in Prophets of the Posthuman, where I talk about the balm in Gilead, because I'm saying here are the prophets, and to just briefly explain, the term comes from Walter Brueggemann, who talked about the prophetic consciousness. And he says that prophets from the Old Testament, but also today, are truth tellers who either um, show up, reveal the dominant consciousness as false and dangerous, or nourish an alternative consciousness. And I argue that many of these writers, especially sci-fi writers, because they like to show us how dangerous our sci-fi thoughts are, like a Frankenstein being one of the very first ones, right? She's definitely challenging the prevailing consciousness of romanticism and also of scientism. Let's just go. We'll make people live forever. This is such a great idea, and I'll just take some dead body parts and put it all together. And then when this being comes to life, the creator's like, what is this? And he rejects his own creation because he realizes, nah, this is not what I meant at all, because I had this idealistic kind of notion of it. So anyway, this idea of challenging the dominant consciousness and nurturing an alternative consciousness. So Marilyn Robinson looks at our society, and we know she knows about scientism because she wrote an entire book called Absence of Mind. And if you haven't read Absence of Mind, run, don't walk, to buy Absence of Mind, because it is an unbelievable takedown of this kind of scientific reductionism account of the brain and the mind and the self. She just nails it. I mean, it's just a beautiful book. So Gilead is like the very opposite of everything that our society teaches us. Like, our society is like, go really fast, use technology to solve problems, that's the way that you improve yourself. And she's like, no, actually, I'm going to take a dying old man who's a pastor for his life, and what he does is read and write sermons, write sermons for a living, and make you read a letter from him to his son while he's dying. So I'm going to slow you way down, and I'm going to remind you of the things that really matter in this life, which is our relationships, the slow way which we learn how to love each other, how easy it is to not love each other, how easy it is to fail to love, and how you have to be brought back to yourself and your limitations constantly to understand your own need for grace. It's the opposite of transhumanism and posthumanism. And so it's just a remarkably beautiful book that changes you because you have to be slow in the reading of it. And so a lot of my students, they would have a real hard time with it, because they're used to hyper attention to texts, and something that we probably will end up talking about in this conversation, reading for information. Like, our society reduces reading to reading for information. It trains us to read for information instead of for an experience of otherness, or what any other number of things it could be. So a book like Gilead forces you to not read for information. You don't get information. You don't even get plot information, which is a kind of information. You get theological reflection on the beauty of human beings and their irreducible particularity. And it doesn't matter whether they are disabled in any way or not. You know, so the genius of Marilyn Robinson is that you take a parable, the parable of the prodigal son, which one could argue is the center of the gospel, right? Like, I love Henri Nouwen on the parable of the prodigal son, where he's just like, the goal of this is to become like the father. That's the goal, is for us to be like the father. And I often tell my students, I go, we have been like every single one of these characters. You've been the older brother sometimes, you've been, the prodigal, you've been the pigs, you've been all these different characters, but the goal is to be more like the father.
Mhm.
She takes that one parable and writes four novels. They're like kind of like the four gospels about this one parable, Gilead being the first of them. I
Mm.
mean, what richness, right? And it's not about speed. It's not about, using your brain to solve problems. It's about grace.
Oh, I mean, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, Christina. And I had a similar experience reading Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich, and that intense focus on memento mori really helped me. And I think that is such a wonderful antidote to much of the poison of modern thinking, unfortunately. And
Hmm.
it also brings to my mind Terrence Malick's films where he doesn't put as much
Yes.
emphasis on the script.
Terrence Malick is a great analog to what's going on with the work of art that Marilyn Robinson is providing for us and that he's providing for us,
Mm,
and that any good painting would provide for you, right? So those are all connected. In fact, mentioning Henri Nouwen talking about Parable of the Prodigal Son, he spends hours looking at the painting by Rembrandt,
yeah.
right? So those things are all connected that you can't rush to the content, the kernel of that, like a paraphrase, and get what it's about. You have to experience it.
Hmm.
A Terrence Malick film forces you to experience it slowly with a sense of wonder. He's got that film To the Wonder, right? And like this kind of, um, it's not going to be packaged for you in a
Hmm.
way that you'll then be able to unpackage and put away like it's an information bit, you
Mm.
know? Nope.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Christina. And in your other book, Beyond the Story, American Literary Fiction and the Limits of Materialism, you build upon some of those themes and you further challenge this reductionist view of literature as mere social commentary, for example. I suppose what led you to write that book then, and how does it encourage readers to see and experience those deeper meanings and stories that we're talking about?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation because it means a lot to me to have readers that I don't even know about who are actually reading my work. But particularly that book, it came out right at the beginning of COVID and it never really got reviewed. It just kind of fell off the radar for a lot of people, and it's my best work. So it's really hard as a scholar to feel like I poured my soul into this book that nobody reads, or nobody talks about, certainly. And that book represents for me the culmination of thinking about all of these issues that we've just been talking about, how the incarnation validates created life, means that the universe is inherently personal, right? And if the universe is inherently personal, scientific naturalism cannot be true, right? It means that there has to be some intelligence behind life, but that also means that life created life, all of being itself is intelligible. That is what I think logos really means. Is I think it has more to do with intelligibility, the fact that you can read it, if you will. If you want to keep the word logos meaning word, then just like that you can read a word, that it's intelligible. Creation can be read, it has meaning, and the meaning is a person, right? That's Colossians 1. So when you say that, and you realize that's your starting point as a thinker, then you look at stories and the existence of stories and all of the thousands of stories that we tell each other, TV, radio, like I try to get my students to imagine what life would be without stories. I go, just try
Mhm,
to imagine. There's no stories. There's no drama. There's not even a story that how you wrecked the car. You can't. There's none. And
mhm,
they're looking at me, which they should, with a dumbfounded look on their face, like I can't even imagine it. You can't, right? Because we organize our world in terms of stories because events happen to us, and we believe that those events are not just random because we have memory. And we, in our memory, we can organize these events like in Gilead. This is what he's doing. He's organizing these events for his son. So this is what a life spent in attention uh, to Jesus will give you. This will yield this kind of life. If you have attention to something else, you'll have a different kind of life. So artists are paying attention to people. This is what they do. And that attention, I argue, is inherently theological.
mhm,
Right. So another way to put it is like if you there's a quote at the beginning of the book from Jacques Maritain where he says, um, "The artist, whether he knows it or not, consults God while looking at things." Okay, the artist, whether he knows it or not. This is not something that is intentional in the sense of that way. Like I meant to be like God.
Mhm.
It's not God as creator. I mean, writer as creator like God. It's God as the one who looks on creation and calls it good, and therefore worthy of being redeemed.
Mhm.
Right. So even the worst characters you can think of have, by this definition, been loved by the writer, the way that God loves each creature, each person
Mhm.
that he's made.
Mhm.
And if he doesn't love it, it's in contradistinction. It's like a rebellion against the whole idea of the novel. You don't
Mhm.
write a novel about somebody if you don't think he's important or interesting
Mhm.
for some reason, right?
Yeah, that resonated with me so much, and it's like maybe a surprising analogy, but it reminded me of some ways of Dr. Stephen Meyer, who's used inference to the best explanation with modern science, to suggest that it's unveiling not just a God, but the God of the Bible, who's created and sustains the universe, and to see that storytelling, the nature of storytelling itself in that light, it does hint to me the God of the incarnation. I suppose I hadn't this pre-planned in my questions, but I'm kind of curious about if we do go that far, why do we say that it's distinctly theological as opposed to, say, a Jungian framework whereby they would say it is just the collective unconscious or something like that?
That's an excellent question, and I'd love to just spend hours talking about that because I do spend a lot of time thinking about that. And when I taught literary theory, and we get to structuralism and the sort of view from the cultural anthropology, right? That's it's sort of like these human tendencies are all underlying. Sorry, my dogs are going nuts. Um, that it's a collective unconscious. It's a kind of a basic primal connection that we all have to one another, and it can be talked about in certain totems and certain universal experiences like birth, death, right, love, sex, blah blah blah. And that is a very powerful argument, right? So, but underneath that, you then have to get to the question of where that consciousness comes from, right? And the Jungian has no explanation for that, uh, except to say either God created some kind of consciousness or it just emerged out of the primordial soup, right? Which is the way that the current scientists would tell that. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is Jungian psychology doesn't overrule the idea of the possibility of a creating consciousness or
Hmm.
that consciousness is completely underlying everything. And nor, but might I add, does quantum mechanics and quantum physics. I got to say, that stuff is mind blowing. The more of that I read, the more you're just like consciousness underlies the entire thing. The universe cannot be impersonal. I don't know if you've read Cormac McCarthy's most recent novels, but he is talking like dealing with that question over and over again in The Passenger. And if you want to link to an article, I reviewed those books. I would love it if you could get that out there because
Absolutely.
it's to me such an interesting question. And the question that I wrote when I was reviewing those novels is: Are we passengers or are we pilgrims? Because he seems to it's like if it's all just reduced to molecules that are spinning around, then we're just passengers in life, right? There's it's just we're born by accident, die by accident, and everything in between is an accident. Or are we created with a true home that's not here,
Hmm.
and to search for, and to me it just kind of comes down to that basic division. But you can't do away with consciousness. So no Jungian can do away with consciousness because that's the center of what they're talking about. They just have to at the end of the day say that it was just a product of the brain, like somebody like Antonio Damasio does, and that book Self comes to mind.
Mm.
It's like you read it very closely, and that's what happened. It's like at some point, somewhere, your brain just produced an eye, like somebody's brain somewhere, right? Between the Neanderthals and whatever, I don't know what those, I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not the, don't know the names of those various men, right? But at some point in one of those evolution of mankind, they just developed the robust first person consciousness. I don't buy that.
Hmm. No, thank you so
So
much, Christina. That's really helpful. And there's some really interesting work. My friend Dr. Spencer Clavin, a classicist actually by training, he did classics at Cambridge, but he's actually written a history of science and delves into what you're describing about quantum mechanics and so on, how it does unveil this very healthy alternative to cruder physicalist model that was dominant, unfortunately, for too long. And he thinks hopefully that that was a blip in the long scale, like long story of mankind. And I think he's right. If
I
for
hope
some
he's
reason,
right because, somebody like Thomas Nagel, who is not necessarily a Christian, right? Not a believer.
hmm
He Mind and Cosmos is that little book that does that makes that same argument. It's just
hmm
like and I love it at the very end, he calls any other kind of explanation Darwinianism of the gaps. I love that so much, right? Because it's always God of the gaps, God of the gaps. Well, this is Darwinianism of the gaps, right? To say, well, we don't know, so let's fill it in with evolution,
hmm No, that's brilliant.
right?
And I also appreciate your point about integrating any virtues within Jungian frameworks and so on within a more comprehensive theological model. I think that's most important. And Dr. Kevin Van Hooser has done wonderful work with his recent Mere Christian hermeneutics, also influenced by Lewis, of course, and shown how some of those things can be integrated. I think that's most helpful to get the
Yes.
more
Kevin's a
multidimensional.
good friend. Kevin and I have talked a lot about these issues. He's a great scholar and thinker and friend. And notably he's like a very musical, very artistic. His wife, his children, who I've taught, Wheaton, I taught his daughter. Um, and one of the things I remember talking to Kevin Van Hooser, we had a seminar. This is a little off track, but it's very interesting. At a Christian scholars seminar at Calvin one summer when I was just starting my career. He was leading it. It was on hermeneutics, and he had invited Richard Rohr to be one of the speakers. And it was so interesting to have Richard Rohr coming and talking to us, right? And then we had lunchtime, and I just got my tray and I sat down. I didn't know that I'd sat right next to Richard Rohr, and I'm like, "Great, what am I going to talk to Richard Rohr about?" And we have been talking about this kind of idea of turtles all the way down. That there is no there's no transcendent meaning. It's just all, these experiences and whatever else. And Kevin Van Hooser told me, he said, one of the most interesting things that I learned about Richard Rohr is that he's not musical. Like there's nothing, he has no interest in music. And I thought that's really telling, isn't it? Right, that there's something about the arts, but music in particular, because it's so non-representational, that you resonate with something bigger than yourself.
Mhm.
Right. And you either have to say that's kind of like a whooshing up experience, like some of the cognitive neuroscience try to describe the experience you have when you're in a sports crowd and it feels like transcendent, but it's really not. You're just all connected, and of course there are psychological explanations for these things, but you can't prove that that's all that there is.
Mhm.
So it's fascinating to me.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Christina. And you mentioned Cormac McCarthy. Well, I'd like to return to him if we may. So, my friend Matt Miller in the States, unfortunately now passed, but he used to have a great YouTube channel. It was named Logos Made Flesh, where he explored the symbolism of different movies and so on. And one of those was actually No Country for Old Men, adopted, of course, from McCarthy by the Coen brothers, who I also love. And you, in your work, do look at McCarthy, and although a different work, I wonder if you might tell us a bit about that and your impressions of The Road and its import for theology, then some of the stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, I love Cormac McCarthy, and like I said about, reading his newest novels before he died, um, it- he is a very deeply pluralistic thinker in the sense of he's really open to any explanations, and in a sense he's trying to try them all out as a novelist, right? So you can't say, oh, he's just a naturalist here, or he's an Augustinian here.
Mhm.
There's no, like, you can always find evidence in the text of something else. um, and that's what I love about it, right? Because that as in general just basically says the world is bigger than the systems that we have to explain it, which to me points to a theological reality that combines all of these things. But for him, not necessarily, right? But I think the road is so primal that it became a kind of the centerpiece of Beyond the Story and this argument that scientific naturalism cannot explain the art of the story. It's so primal that this man wants to keep his son alive and speaks about that in theological terms. Like he's like, if this is not the voice of God, then God never spoke. You know, and you could argue, and people have argued, that that's just man making up a transcendent, explanation for the love of a father of the son, and and the his idea that goodness will find the boy it always has. These things that are in the road, you could make that argument, but I just think it makes more sense to just say that novel is about waiting for God to show up. And then at the end, he does in the form of this other family who doesn't want to eat the boy, basically. And so Cormac McCarthy scholars disagree about this, right? So I was in Berlin at a Cormac McCarthy conference. It was one of the great experiences that I had as a McCarthy aficionado. I mean, I've written a lot about McCarthy, but I'm not a McCarthy scholar. So I went and just to ask people, I'm like, why do you think he didn't kill the boy off at the end? Because he could have, It was like, and I say, what to my students, what would happen if it stopped here? What would happen if it stopped here? How would because it feels like it's a flip of the coin, right? It feels like that throughout. And all of them said, the ones I talked to, it's just because of his own son, and he just couldn't imagine him dying. That was that. And I was like, yeah, that doesn't disprove the existence of God either, does it? It doesn't, it's like he is sensitive to these deeper movements of the universe. What I'm trying to say is he's a deeply cosmological writer. And, sort of untangling all of those different elements is so fascinating because that's
Mm.
what gives his fiction its power, and it's got immense power.
Mm-hmm.
The Road is an immensely powerful novel, and No Country for Old Men is really kind of one of his pot boilers, right? Like written for the screen, but even still, it's got immense power because of its focus on evil and sugar. Like this evil person. Why? And what does evil really look like?
Mm-hmm.
It looks like flip of a coin. Heads you live, tails you die.
Mm-hmm.
That's evil,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, that's powerful stuff. Thank you so much, Christina. And before we started recording, we actually talked about the order of your books. So the Incarnational Art of Flannery O'Connor came before the others, but I thought it might be interesting to talk about it after now because in some ways I think it sharpens and distills some of the things that we've already mentioned, and I'd love to look at that and this transcendent and immanent nature of storytelling as embodied in O'Connor's work, and maybe consider that book. So it explores the profound theological dimensions of O'Connor's fiction. What inspired you to write about O'Connor specifically, and what do you hope readers will take away from that book then?
Yeah, that was when I started graduate school. I went to graduate school at Emory University in Atlanta. Okay, so Southern University. And I had been teaching high school in Louisiana before that. Now, I'm an Air Force brat, so I had lots of different homes growing up in the United States, okay? And in the Panama Canal Zone where I lived when I was 11 years old. When I started reading Southern fiction written by Southern United States writers
Mm.
in the Southern United States, I was like enamored of their sense of place. And their sense of place rooted them not only to the land and to the landscape, but to their faith and to their community, like Wendell Berry, right? You're you have a sense of responsibility to your community. You're standing with and by your community as you're standing by language and reality. And I found that inherently appealing and lacking in our overall general American culture, which is always like look forward and forget about the past. The Southern writers like Faulkner are like, sorry, you can't forget about the past. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Hello, here it is, but in the form of a ghost. And that ghosts, as Flannery O'Connor said, are fierce and instructive. And they are these things that we try to push away because we don't want to believe are true. And one of the things we don't want to believe true is that man is made in the image of God,
Hmm.
because that would make us have to be responsible to God, right? So then it comes back as a ghost, and it comes into your life, and it comes in these strange forms because God is there and he's a person who's trying to reach you, and you don't want to be reached. So you end up with a bull goring you or a rock thrown in your face or some sort of what she would call moment of grace where you're just like, this is undeniable. This is something outside of me, not just the bull or whatever it is, but like some reality that I can't produce. So when I went to Atlanta and I started working with Elizabeth Fox Genovese, who's a historian, an immense, she's dead now, but like, I mean, Southern history and women's studies, she is just a giant. Okay. So I got to work with her, which was amazing. And she was the first person to teach me O'Connor, along with Welty and Hurston. And so as I was studying with her, I was like, O'Connor represents everything I care about. Intellectual concerns related to Christianity, women's issues, anti-Gnosticism, this sort of like this Gnostic sort of problem with American intellectual life. I was like, this will like me allow me to study whatever I want, whatever issues I want. And sure enough, that was the case. And as I dug deep in, I read all of the writers and the philosophers uh, that she read. And so that I could get a sense of what her intellectual base and foundation was. And then I wrote that out of that because what I discovered is that for her, the incarnation is the fulcrum that lifts all of her stories because it's the fundamental reality of the universe. Again, the universe is personal. And if this is true, then everything else is changed by it. Right. And so her characters are put in these kinds of stark situations because of that fact, And so let me get less abstract and just talk about like the story everybody reads. Good Man is Hard to Find, right? It's the one that's anthologized. You probably even read that over in Ireland, right? Good Man is Hard to Find.
Yeah.
It's like this misfit is this criminal who's running around south, and there's this family, the grandmother and her son and their children, and the grandmother is just a good country people. She's just kind of like this nice, sweet grandmother, right? Kind of full of herself and thinks she's just fine the way she is. And so she's like, oh, let's go. I know where this great place. Let's do this. And they end up in this ironic situation where this criminal that they've heard about, they actually run into, right? And then he starts threatening the family, killing them off one by one. Like this is why the Coen brothers were so influenced by Flannery O'Connor because this is death. I mean, these people die, you know, and the criminal has a gun in her face. Misfit has a gun in her face. She had just heard her son get shot over the horizon, just beyond the trees. And then she has a literal come to Jesus moment, right? Where she looks at him and she realizes you're actually no different from me. I've been thinking that I'm a good person, but you're like one of my babies. You might as well be, and it has this kind of moment of recognition. I'm not all that. I'm not a good person. There's no difference between you and me in that way. And then he shoots her 3 times in the chest, and there's all the symbolism and stuff that comes after that. And then, of course, the famous line is she'd have been a good woman if there had just been someone to shoot her every minute of her life. So the great profound need we have for O'Connor is the profound need we have for eventful experiences that put us into reality. Like we create these kind of delusional self pictures, right? That are really like of who we are and our place in the world. And we need to be displaced from those illusions. That's spirituality. So Flannery O'Connor would say it's better for her to have 30 seconds of reality, which is I'm not the center of the universe. I'm a sinner. I need God, than to live a whole life and die as a good person.
Mhm.
Right. So my students are like, why do they have to kill her? Well, she didn't have to kill her, but she had to be brought to death to have that discovery, which is worth all the rest of her life, you know.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to tell about that in these stories and repeatedly tell about it. But if you don't want the person to die, then just read something like Good Country People, where the woman has a wooden leg, it's taken away from her, and she's left up in the hayloft trying to think about herself as not so smart. So
No, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Christina. And It's also interesting to me. I was a big Bruce Springsteen fan growing up, and
Oh, well, Bruce Springsteen and Flannery O'Connor, they're right together. Yes.
yeah, I when I
Nebraska, Nebraska.
yeah, exactly. And it was only I got intimations of it, but it was only in watching his show on Broadway that I noticed how distinctly theological a lot of his themes were, and he went into it at length. So then to look back at the Nebraska and the influence of O'Connor, sort of piece things together in interesting ways for me. That was quite interesting. Just for those who are like me, maybe coming from popular culture to these deeper themes, I think is that's a good way to get to O'Connor and folks like that. And
Well, it's
hopefully,
true, and the Coen brothers, but also your
mhm.
Irish writer that I can't remember his name, who wrote the Innisphere that movie, McDonald or McDonough.
McDonough, yeah.
Yes, also him. Yes,
Mhm.
same kind of influences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christina. And I suppose then, what do you see as the especially enduring legacy of O'Connor's work, and then in light of her Catholic perspective, and that's not necessarily just Roman Catholic, that could be sacramental undercurrents across the different Christian traditions, and then her engagement with themes like grace and redemption. I suppose, in contrast, in many ways, to it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, much modern storytelling, which seems I think, inordinately focused on expressive individualism and this kind of constant hermeneutic of suspicion. All our heroes need to be torn down and so on, which kind of frustrates me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big question, of course, right? And we're coming up on her the anniversary, 100th anniversary of her birth in March. So this next month, March 23rd, 5th, 25th, 2025 is, 1925, 100 years later. So it's kind of a big moment for O'Connor scholars coming up this year. And there are a lot of us, and we all know each other, and we're all ultra committed to making sure that she's continuing to be read in spite of all of the really difficult and thorny issues dealing with race and some of the things that she wrote in some of her letters. Uh, because of this sense that she has of that you can't figure things out, spiritual things out just through your mind, through your own resources. You need an outside presence because this is an outside reality that's breaking in. That is the really pernicious problem with Gnosticism and Gnostic thinking is that it's extremely self-reliant, right? It's like I have all the resources that I need right now, and and that's just so wrong. you know, it ends up just with contempt for other actual people as well as contempt for your own body, which is what is interesting to me about transhumanism. And when I was talking about my friend Ben, it's like he writes about that too. It's like he talks about how he met Nick Bostrom and how Nick just felt completely. Nick Bostrom's a famous transhumanist. Like he just seemed unhappy in his own skin, because it's like if you think you're self-sufficient and it's all up to you to live forever, it's all on you because there is no afterlife. It's a very lonely and horrible and selfish place to live. And Flannery O'Connor is asking us to think about love. Love for other people is the center of the universe. It's the center goal of our existence.
Hmm.
Um, and
No,
that's why not everybody's perfect and there are weak people, right? We need to learn to love everybody,
mhm.
right? It's weak and the strong.
No, absolutely. And to your point before, it is what Paulie Miller, a spiritual writer from the States, calls the J curve. So you might have to go into death, but then you're restored to a higher form in redemption than you were beforehand. And love does have that cruciform. It's not just a woolly notion of love and so on. I think that's quite.
No, and in fact, one of the worst things about English, and I know you understand this, is that they've got one word for love. Like I love pizza and I love God, and it's just so limiting. This one word, it's like one of the biggest flaws in English. So we have to constantly qualify. We're not talking about that kind of love when you say I love pizza or I love you, and because my ego is so, fulfilled by you, as opposed to I really want what's best for you.
Hmm.
That's what it means to love. That's Aquinas.
Yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
and we're just not good at that. Americans are particularly not good at that. We're really good at loving ourselves.
Mm. I don't know how much better Irish people are.
Okay, I wasn't make comparing to. I just this is what I know. I mean, I'm an Americanist and I know American culture. So
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Christina. And so I might use this opportunity then to hear what you think of the importance of short stories as a medium, and whether for reading or for listening to. As my wife and I are oral storytellers, we recently did a little certificate with the Storytellers of Ireland, and I personally have found it easier to engage with short stories and oral storytelling than novels. And I wonder if some of us maybe have been inordinately impacted by kind of digital liturgies, and so to speak, and whether we'll struggle attending to longer pieces, like we mentioned Malik and some of those folks. I fear that we're going to miss out on that. I wonder if you might speak to that in a bit more, about the importance of maybe refining ourselves to those.
I'm so glad to have that question because the center of my research now is on attention and attention to literature and how it can be transformative, not just literature, but to all of the arts. How there are ways that the arts and attending to the arts transform us that nothing else can do. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about Gilead, right? Because you can't just get the nugget out of that. You actually have to have the experience of reading it to have the transformation that is available to you. And we live in a society which is constantly at cross purposes with attention, deep attention to things that can actually transform us. And we're reading for information and hyper quick little pieces, and we live in a world of distraction. And attention is the commodity that's constantly being taken from us. Like you get little notifications on your phone or whatever. And so there's somebody who's always trying to grab your attention, right? So one of the most Christian and deep spiritual things that you can do is train your attention on things that are worthy of it. And especially for young people because school is harder now than ever before in this sense, in this regard. I do a lot of I did supervise student teachers who were from the college becoming high school teachers. And I got to the point at the end of my career of doing this where I would say to them, you really need to set aside class time where they just read silently because they don't have any experience of this, where the phones are put away, and either like read silently or read to them as a bigger part of the curriculum for just the reasons that you're talking about. I love this project that you and your wife are working on. I think that's fantastic because there is something in the hearing of it that because you're trained to read in a hyper fashion when you're looking at a screen, hearing is a different thing, right? It's a different thing. And so you have to really work harder. You can't stop it, right? Like it's kind of like watching a film, right? Like you can't, well, you could turn it over. It's more like a play. You have to listen, you have to be attentive, and you can't stop it when you're listening. You could, but you know what I mean.
Mhm.
So it's helping us to recover some of those deeper attentive skills, I think, or it can. Um, Audiobooks are really big right now, and they're actually bigger in my own life than in the past, partly because I had to give away a lot of my books to move to Texas. And I mean, I'm talking about like three-quarters of my library, and it was really painful. It was like pulling my heart out just because I just couldn't have all of these thousands of books, right, in my new house because there's no place for them. And they don't have an office anymore.
Mhm.
And so it's like I'm going to the library and getting books, and a lot of times they don't even have the ebook, they just have the audiobook. So I'm like, okay, I'll listen to Dracula. I wanted to write about Dracula and Nosferatu. That's something I'm working on right now. And so I'm listening to it, and it's a totally different experience. Yeah, but and I think it's because my own reading, and I read for a living, has been diminished because of the way that my brain has been trained by our digital culture,
Mhm.
right? So the listening to the oral stuff is helping me recover a deeper attention. If it 20 years ago would have been the opposite, I would have said, I can't listen to this,
Mhm.
but I can read it. Now it's like switching. Isn't that weird? This
Mhm.
is something in myself. I mean, I can't extend that to all of culture, but it it's a way to help us to recover it. So I lead a book group here called Faith and Fiction book group for my church, and we did Gilead, and I actually could not find my Gilead copy because I had just moved here. So I got it and listened in the audio, and it was totally a different experience. The
Hmm.
spoken, lovely story. But that doesn't speak to the issue of short stories, which I do think are special because they require even deeper attention because everything is so compacted. Like Flannery O'Connor is everything matters. And so they can be a good way to train that attention to, and in a way, kind of sneak around a little bit. Like 'cause it's so short, you're like, I can pay attention to this one short story, right? So it's a
Hmm.
little sneaky. Um, uh, but famously, right, short story writers can't make any money and can't sell books, so they're always having to write novels and do whatever, which is a real shame because Flannery O'Connor wrote short stories. I don't know if you're familiar with George Saunders. He's one of my favorite American writers. Brilliant short stories. It's a medium that has real power.
Mm.
Um, and you can read it aloud. In fact, my sister-in-law has a group that was meeting at her house. I said, "It's tonight. I'm gonna have to ask her how it went." She was asking me for recommendations for short fiction that she could read, um, that would be not too heavy, but would. So she's like, none of that, Coen Brothers type stuff. None of that, but not too heavy, but funny and but also thought provoking.
Hmm.
And so I, went through my inner Rolodex and my computer and try to think of a story that would work well for that particular group of women. And I ended up with Alice Walker's story, Everyday Use. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it, there are these stories. It does, you don't have to develop them over a novel to really get something profound out of it.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Christina. And I think it's most vital and it's a wonderful initiative to read together aloud. I think that's really beautiful. There's a lady, Megan Cox Gurdon from the States, and she calls it the Enchanted Hour. And she
Oh,
talks.
I love that.
So I think that's hopefully a bit of a revival taking place. And we're hoping to bring it, as I say, to Ireland. So God willing, we can do a good job with that. But I want to turn next to your book, The Flourishing Teacher, Vocational Renewal for a Sacred Profession. So my background was in primary school teaching, and I loved it. But unfortunately, in many cases, the way I was maybe formed and thought about teaching was about more about behavior management done as this sacred profession, and it's only over time discovering classical educators and all different sorts of folks, unschoolers, homeschoolers, everything that have got different layers of what it means to be a teacher and its import and so on. So I want to ask a bit about that book and because it's heartfelt and it's a practical resource for educators. Could you maybe share the central message and inspiration behind it, first of all?
Sure. That book was the easiest of the four books to write because it's more colloquial, right? And it was just me drawing on my 20 years of experience of as a teacher and the things that I wish that I had somebody to tell me when I was a young professional. Not by primary school, you mean like teenagers, right? Like our what we
Elementary,
call.
it'd be
Oh,
elementary.
for you it's elementary. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, God bless you. I could never do that. But I found that I couldn't do high school either because what you find out from teaching high school is you have to love the students more than you love the subject. And I couldn't I love them equally. Uh, and they hated what I was teaching.
Mm.
So I was just like, this is not going to work. So, but when I got to college and started teaching college, after getting PhD, we were like, I hope this works because I'm spending 5 years getting this PhD. I hope I like teaching college because I didn't like teaching high school, and I did. And I just wanted to pass on some ideas to the generation, like I said, to write the book that I wanted to read when I was younger. Where it's like, this is hard. The central message of this book is teaching is hard, but it is the most important vocation that there is. You wouldn't be doing it if you didn't think that your discipline was essential for students to grow, into whole persons. If you don't believe that, you shouldn't be a teacher, right? So I just wanted to encourage that. I wanted to spark the joy of that and then give practical advice about how to get through when it gets hard because it gets hard. It gets
Mm.
tough, you know.
Absolutely. And then how do you see teaching as a distinct calling, building on that? And maybe what is some of the
Mhm.
advice that you give educators nowadays in striving to flourish in that vocation?
Yeah, I do think it's a distinct calling. I mean, I think most of us who become educators have these moments in our lives where we're just like, yeah, I was realizing that I was pointing my fork at the person across, and I was,
Yeah.
like prophetically or just energetically teaching some. It's like you can't help it, right? Um, but it's a calling in the sense of you get insight, especially for college professors or university, I guess you would say in Britain. Um, your deep need to learn more about the subject that you feel is really important and critical for people to understand. Like we've been talking about the subjects that I think are critical for us to understand for spiritual growth and intellectual growth. And then you're like, I can't help but try to get others to see this. And then you become a teacher because that's the place where that happens,
Mhm.
right? Um, and it's one person at a time. It's like this classroom at a time, and and you get that maybe you'll have 15 students in a class or 30, and there'll be one like the leper that comes back and says thank you for this, but it doesn't matter because that's your job. That's what you're there to do, is to try to spark that little bit of excitement about this particular discipline and why this particular discipline is so important you
Mhm.
know and it could be, I mean, if you're an astrophysics professor, which in another life I'll be studying astrophysics. I don't have the math or the capacity for it, but I think it's so cool, right? That you're that teacher who goes like, this is the coolest thing ever, and here's why. And then that person's universe has changed, right?
Mhm.
That's what teaching is.
Mhm. That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Christina. And then to give another example, I wonder if you might tell us about your suggestions about not working whenever you're exhausted, which is unfortunately common in our modern hedonistic treadmill society.
Well, that is, in fact, one of my favorite things to talk about because now that I've retired from teaching, and the reason for that is because my husband had been underemployed uh, the almost the last 10 years of our marriage because of my career. And so when our son was ready to go on to college, to university, it's like it's now or never for him to become a rector. He's been a priest. There was no positions for him to be the rector. And so now he's a rector here in Texas. And in the American university system, I'm sure it's like this in Great Britain. There's no, you just don't get a job at the university level wherever you go. You have to be willing to go anywhere. So I knew that I wasn't going to be teaching college at the level that I've been at.
Mhm.
So that's why we're here. And I totally forgot what I was talking about when I had that little bit of, what was I
Oh,
answering?
just about your suggestions for whenever someone's
Oh, and start. Yes. What I meant to say was that I'm glad that I'm not teaching anymore because I'm tired, but also because I love to encourage teachers. That's where my vocation lies right now. It's kind of morphed into how can I help others? So this book was the beginning of that. I also lead retreats, faculty retreats and faculty development days. I like to go places and give this message. And I like for it to be in the form of a retreat. And I like to really emphasize things like keeping the Sabbath, keeping yourself in a kind of Sabbath mentality where it's not work all the time, keeping yourself whole, that you're not a tool to be used by the university. You have to, teaching is hard. So you have to have that well of living water constantly being refilled, or you can't do what you really are there to do. It's not to cross somebody's boxes on the assessment thing, it's to impact lives. And so I try to encourage teachers to do that. That's what my true love is. So, yeah. So if you're working all of the time and you're not taking a Sabbath, that means that you're not trusting that God is able to do with the time that you have given enough. And it's usually from fear. It's the fear of not getting advancement in your career, or yourself internally, like I'm not good enough, like imposter syndrome or whatever. You're not designed to work 24/7 to prove to other people that you're good enough. You are good enough. God has you in this position as a teacher right now, and He needs you, and your students need you to be a whole person first. Then you can give out of that. The rest of it, it's not important.
Mm.
So if it can't be done, if your work can't be done in the times of the day that you give it, then you need to either rework the way you work or get another career.
Mhm. Oh,
you
that's
know?
brilliant. Thank you so much. That's great advice, Christina. And I suppose again, then considering many of us are living in an expressive individualist culture, and not just in America, which elevates the self-will in some ways above all else, and it's very antithetical to the gospel in many ways. What is the place and the limit of willpower in the life of a healthier and a more well-rounded teacher then?
That's a really good question. As you know, I read a lot of books on willpower for the book and also just for myself because it's an incredibly interesting, newish area of social science research. Willpower, they've done a lot of research on it, and I wanted to read up on it. And it's just unbelievable when you find out that willpower is a muscle that you wear out by the end of the day. And teaching requires it's decision fatigue. So much of teaching is not only the energy of being in front of the classroom, but if you're grading papers, you get decision fatigue. You wear out. And so you don't have the willpower to make good decisions uh, at the end of the day that you did at the beginning. And so you might, have that third glass of wine or eat that bag of Tostitos, as I talk about in the book, because you've already given it all away. So you need to be first thing is you need to be very aware of that, very aware that you're human and your willpower only lasts so long. And so you need to structure your day around that reality, right?
Mhm.
And be like, you know what, first of all, I can't be working all the time. I found this out a lot of ways. One of them was like I would get a stack of papers and I would grade them all at once. And then I would realize I was just getting nasty at the end. I was like, this is not fair to the students who I happened to pick up their last exam and all other kinds of problems, with it. And then I started getting papers in small bunches. And so I would regularly grade like 5 to 6 papers every Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning throughout the whole semester rather than getting a stack.
Mhm.
So things like that kind of help you to work against your inherent weaknesses. And also for me, it's like the morning time is the only time that was worth anything for doing hard work like grading or prepping for a class or writing. Those morning is it, and to not try to push it in the afternoon because I'm not going to be productive and it's just going to be a waste of time. And no, and you learn that about yourself, right? Like for me, some people it's night, right? Like that's when they're the most productive. It's at nighttime. Find out where your energy is at its height and use your best judgment there. And then the rest of the time, rest when you're really resting,
I'm into that.
right? Because if you don't take the Sabbath, you're like giving up the best internal sort of gift of rest that there is. And it's a command too. So you could just, if that's what you need to motivate you. But once you actually do it, you're like, this is the best thing ever.
Hmm.
I get to step out of this whole framework of being and just be myself, you know.
No, that's excellent. And alongside your work, there's another book, The Common Rule, which delved into some of those themes that really helped me give practical advice for how to manage habits and so on. I think that was most fruitful, and I've been recommending it to different friends who.
Oh, yeah, there's another book that I really like that I want to recommend for your list. It's called Time Management for Mortals. It's not a Christian writer, but Oliver Berkman is the writer. Time Management for Mortals. 4,000 weeks. 4,000 weeks is the title. And 4,000 weeks is a shorthand for how many weeks you've been given on Earth, most of us on average, to live.
Mhm.
And the reason why he calls it that is because it's not a book about time management. It's a book about how you inhabit time. And so I talk a lot about this with these retreats that I go on. When you think of your life in terms of weeks as opposed to years, it helps you to reframe it a little bit and go like, okay, so every week now I go like, okay, for this week I'm on the 2,975th week of my life. Okay, that's almost 3/4, right, for me. And so a week is a lot of time, but it's not that much. Do you see what I'm doing with this? It's like there's a lot of things you can do in a week, but there's not everything that you can do in a week. And it helps you to kind of focus on what do I really want at this point in my life that I've got 3/4, if I'm lucky, 3/4 of my life, I still have a quarter left.
Mhm.
Right? What do I want? What do I want with that? How am I going to inhabit the time that God has given me? And it's not going to be rushing around like in a FOMO state of mind, oh my gosh, I'm missing out on this, I'm missing out on that. I've got to do more, I got to be more. It's not about doing more or being more. It's about just being,
Mhm.
in the particular idiom, your calling
Mm.
that you've been given. So I just love that book. That book is it's really good.
Mm.
4,000 weeks. So
That's wonderful. Thank you, Christina. And my last question then on that particular book is, I suppose, what has been the place of creativity in your own practice, and why is it important? I suppose again, especially at a time when too many of us are merely consumers, and that's the case in school and out of school, unfortunately.
that was one of my favorite questions that you had because it's underappreciated in our frenetic, busy culture, right? Because one thing you can't do when you're super busy and constantly working is be creative. There's a mug in the English department to be like, be creative now, hurry up, and it's just like, no, you can't do it. And yet we've got this culture of assessment within university systems and just everything where it's like forcing things that can't be forced. And so, if you want, and you should want, creativity to take a bigger role in your life, what you have to do is let go of doing and just do a lot less and give it space. And one of the things that I discovered was that I was more creative if I had less time to prepare a lesson because I was less in control of it and more letting the other parts of my brain go, like, okay, what's really important here? How can I creatively, approach this particular lesson? As opposed to, well, I'm teaching. An example that I give in the book is I taught Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk for years. And I was teaching it again, and I always try to reread books when I teach them because otherwise, because I do mostly discussion, and so I have to have it fresh, right? Well, I had not read that for like 2 years, and I was teaching it the next day, and my son was throwing up, vomiting in his bed, and I was like trying to catch it in my hand, like you do when you're a mom. And so I had no sleep and no time to read it. And so I had 30 minutes to a class, and I was like, what am I going to do? And so then I shut down the sort of like, this is what I should do, and got to what would actually help them to understand what's important about this.
Mm.
And it's like a different part of your brain. And so it's focusing. And I was like, oh, what I really want them to do is find out what is not to be missed. So I broke them into groups and I just said, you guys as a group decide what's the most important thing from this book that you think it would be really wrong for us not to talk about.
Mm.
And then tell the rest of us why. And I still use that lesson to this day, because it opened things up because of my creativity. So
Mhm.
the way I put it in the book is that creativity costs in content. What it costs in content, it delivers in energy. So you may, as a speaking as a teacher. So like I knew my students were really tired as I was tired. It's late in the spring, it's March or April or whatever. And I was like, I got to do Virginia Woolf's, Room of One's Own. I love this text. Like I love Room of One's Own. So it's not about me and, but I didn't have it that day. And I knew they didn't have it. So I said, you guys get in groups of 4 or 5 and come up with a skit from your favorite scene from this novel.
Mm.
Okay, cost all the content that I should have passed down to them about A Room of One's Own. But what do you think they're going to remember 20 years from now? Right, because their energy level was so much better. And they forced them to look at the text and find out what was really going on there.
Mhm.
So it cost in content, but it yields in energy. So,
No, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Christina. And even from my perspective, doing that less is more focus, I think, is really interesting from the storytelling. They give us the advice to just have the bones of the story, maybe beginning, middle, end, and
ah,
then you can get so many different creative versions once you don't try and over plan it bit by bit, and
yeah.
it's so rewarding that way.
Less is more is one of my favorite things to say at these retreats that I lead. Less is more, people. Less is more. One of my favorite other things is by a linebacker named Rain Lewis, who's an American football player. Success is one thing, impact is another. You could be very successful as a teacher and have very low impact.
Yeah.
What you're after is impact.
Yeah, and then even to your point before, in terms of a Christian perspective, you never know. You can't just reduce it to the metrics of modernity. You could be planting the seed in someone that's going to bear fruit way down the line. So we might be in that evangelist position without necessarily knowing it at the time. I think that's really helpful to keep in mind for teachers or any Christian.
It is anybody, right? Anybody. You just don't know that the person that you're interacting with at your Starbucks or whatever, your local cafe, the barista that serves you, you don't know where they're at, what they're thinking about. And if you're just like, on your own thing and not relaxed into the moment and inhabiting time like a human being instead of a robot, you're going to miss out on
Mhm.
whatever it is that God wants to do through you for this person,
Amen.
you know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. And to conclude today, then, I want to ask you about other projects that you're currently working on or books that we might look out for that you might want to tell us about.
Well, you caught me at the absolute center of me trying to figure out what's next, right? Because now that I'm not under the pressure of, and I haven't been because I was full professor by the time I retired. So I wasn't under the same pressure to publish that I was because I had no other goals to make, right? Um, and since I told you about my struggles with not being read, with this book that I wrote that I thought was really important. So now I'm like, what should I be writing? What should I be working on? I mean, I have these things that I really want to think about. And I mentioned this whole question of how your imagination, when you're reading art and absorbing art, is transformed. So there's a way in which I'm taking those ideas and instead of putting them into a book, I'm putting them into pieces of essays that I'm writing all over the place right now. So I write for Comment. It's out of Canada. I don't know if you're familiar with Comment magazine. Current Pub is another like an online publication that I write for periodically. So I'm figuring out. I might get a Substack eventually. I don't know. I'm still exploring that. Um, but I'm just trying to figure out how to put the things that I'm interested in uh, into a form that is accessible
Mhm.
for people and could actually get lead them to read the things that I think are transformative, right? Because you've no doubt heard that my main goal as a teacher is to get people to read the things that I think are transformative, right? And an academic book isn't going to do that. It might encourage some I hope some professors in the way that they teach, but it's not changing the larger guild because the larger guild of literary studies is completely ignoring it,
Mhm.
you know. So what's my goal? My goal is to get people to read books. How am I going to do that?
Wonderful.
You know?
We share that goal. And
So,
then for those who are watching or listening, you've hinted at a few things there. Maybe where else can they learn more about you and your work and stay updated in those projects?
yeah, I have a website it's ChristinaBieberLake.com. It's not about my scholarly work. It's more this vocational interest in encouraging other teachers and coaching and things like that. And you can certainly contact me through that website. Um, I'm not good with the website, so I have to figure out how to do it to fit to do the other things in it. And this is just something that I don't enjoy, so it's like I put it off, right? So the website, nothing is going on with it as a result because that's not the kind of thing that gets me going in the morning, right? So I'm still trying to figure that out. I'm also find self-promotion distasteful, so I'm not a good like platform builder and all those words like Instagram and
Mhm.
stuff. I just don't do that. But maybe I should. I don't know. But Substack I might do because it seems like a different kind of place to get ideas across. But I'm not sure about that either. So we'll see.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you so much for your time today and your wonderful insights. And I hope God continues to bless you and your ministry.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.